It's good to be the king.
Okay, friends, I agree with quite a lot of what Paul has said, not everything, but I agree with much of it. Though I would just start by saying that much of what he said is applicable to Europe today, but the two largest countries in the world are China and India, where you have a huge amount of industrial production going on. And people have to bear in mind that lots of everyday commodities that are being produced today, which are not being produced in the United States, but are being produced in China. So it's not that the need for this form of production disappears. The Americans were very clever in what they did in offloading all this to China, which has created, for most parts of the last decade, a booming economy with a very high GDP. India hasn't quite gone that way, but because its problems are much greater in terms of governance, but one can't ignore these countries because though we live in Europe and we talk about Europe, effectively the center of the world market has shifted eastwards. And this is something that has to be registered. And this has happened regardless of the fact that the most recent technical innovations have come from the United States. As we know from the West Coast, the web, all that associated with it. We know that, but this is also now available to the rest of the world and is used in China, Japan, India, etc. So it's something to bear in mind. Secondly, I just want to say before I talk about the European Union, which is linked, about what a depressing time it is to be in Greece. And I say this as a friend of the Greek left, of the Greek people, having been in solidarity with them since '67. That's the time I was here at a big peace conference and all the foreign visitors had to be rushed back because rumors were spreading that a coup was about to take place, and indeed the very next day it did, and that was a military coup. And we know what happened for the next 7 or 8 years. And then we had a huge hopes were invested in PASOK. And many of you here who live in this country, amongst the older ones, will remember that when PASOK first came to power in '81, Andreas Papandreou was actually talking about Gramsci and Trotsky and other great thinkers. And to be fair to them, they did a lot in their first year in office. That can't be taken away from them. They did modernize and democratize the Greek state. But then we know what happened, and I'm not going to go into that. By the end of the 80s and 90s, PASOK itself had become infected with the cancer of corruption and power, and as the years went by, they had very little that differentiated them in concrete terms and policies from the center-right. And in my book, The Extreme Center, I argue that this is the politics, the economics of neoliberalism imposed on politics that creates this type of society. And it's happening gradually, sometimes not so gradually, everywhere. So we had the crisis of 2008. And Joseph Stiglitz said, the week of the crisis, he wrote, this crisis is going to be the Berlin Wall of capitalism. Everything will have to be dismantled, and we will now have to move towards other solutions. He meant, of course, Keynesian and left Keynesian solutions, and he was, alas, proved wrong. And that's the interesting thing. that when they had a moment to think and reflect, the rulers of the world, or the Western world, the dominant world, decided to carry on as before. Greece, the weakest link in the European chain, broke first. And from 2010 till now, we have seen what has happened to this country. You know the figures. I mean, on virtually every social level, large numbers of people, not a few thousand, large numbers of people have been adversely affected. Almost 50% youth unemployment. Medical research institutes in this country telling us very bluntly that between 35 and 40% of the population is underfed. Underfed. This, and numerous other statistics I could point out. And it was in response to all this that the social movements, the occupations of squares, the dozens of general strikes all over Greece came out and protested against that. And Syriza was the organization they chose in which to invest their hopes. It's the social movements that made Syriza what it is today. Important to understand that. It's not just the original nuclei which comprised Syriza. And that social movement, strongly supportive of the Thessaloniki program. If you have time, go and read the Thessaloniki program tonight when you go back home. Just reread it, those of you who've read it. A perfectly decent program, promising to reverse the course that has wrecked Greece. And they won on the basis of that program. In the meantime, even before Syriza came to power, the German finance ministry, livid and angry when they found out that Greece had been cooking the books. But you know, they were cooking the books with the help of Goldman Sachs. That's what they were doing in order to get the convergence right for entering the Eurozone, which was a fake. They did cook the books, but the Germans knew. Why didn't they stop it at the time? Why didn't they? Everyone knew. It wasn't a big secret, and nor was Greece the only country that was doing it. The Italians were pretty nifty as well. Cooking the books, yes. And after the crisis, then they came to their senses, and in Tim Geithner, who's a Wall Street guy appointed by Obama as his first Treasury Secretary, had to confront all this, and Geithner's basic response was reduce the debt, but make sure that the investors are paid. That's what the bailouts were all about, paying the investors. And you know, when you think about it, just as a footnote, if you count up the money paid to all the top banks, trillions of dollars, not billions, trillions of dollars. Can we believe this nonsense that there's not enough money in the banks of the Eurozone to bail Greece out just like that? They could do it if they wanted, but they don't do it. And they don't do it not for economic reasons, because economically it would be beneficial to them. They don't do it for political reasons. They don't do it because they don't want the Syriza model to spread to Spain, to capture Ireland, to make people think again something's possible. Not too much, but something's possible. So they decided, even before Syriza came, Geithner said, the German finance minister, and he quotes it, told him in 2010, we're going to teach the Greeks a lesson. They lied to us, they suck, they were profligate and took advantage of the whole thing, and we're going to crush them. In so many words, quoted in Tim Geithner's memoirs. And Geithner said his response was this. He quotes himself and what he said to the German finance minister. You can put your boot on the neck of those guys if that's what you want to do. But you must also give the investors what they want. That is the difference, if you like, between American policy and EU policy. And so it has been going on. So this is what they were doing to previous governments. And when Syriza comes to power, on the very first meeting on the 20th of February in Berlin, Schäuble told Tsipras and Varoufakis very openly, forget your program. The program on which you're elected, forget it. Okay, if you want, we'll call the Troika the institutions if you want a tiny concession. Okay, if you want, we won't directly come and inspect your books, but you do it in any case and we'll check them in Brussels. That's all. That is all. And the big mistake these comrades made was to come back and pretend that this was a victory. You've had to abandon your entire political program and that's a victory? Not just 1 point or 2 points or this or that, the whole program. And that was the sign for the rest of the world that democracy, in fact, as far as these guys are concerned, doesn't matter a damn. That's what happened. And then it carried on, and the logic led to this. And let me tell you that all the Greek comrades I've spoken to, some pro the government, some not in favor of it, are agreed on this, that the size of the referendum victory shook the European elite. It shook them because they were not prepared for it, because the propaganda campaign they waged, the propaganda blitzkrieg, what was it? If you vote no, it means you want to leave the Eurozone. Every single mainstream newspaper, every mainstream politician, all these jokers who teach lessons to the Greek people, like Juncker, sort of runs a Ruritanian duchy called Luxembourg, which is the biggest tax evasion center in Europe, and they want the Greeks to pay more tax. And that's the size of the referendum was such that I think the Syriza leaders were given by their own people a lot of room, or at least some room to maneuver, to play around, to say, but they were shattered themselves, it appears, by the size of the referendum. 61%, that means we have to do something. Within 48 hours, they decided to capitulate. The sacking of Varoufakis was the first step. The Europeans said they didn't want to deal with him. Well, why should they determine who the Greek delegation is? In any event, Varoufakis himself was not at all happy with what they were going to do. That's now clear. Whatever people think of him, like him, loathe him, it's irrelevant. That's effectively what he did. And we now have, and I'm not used to mincing words. I'm sorry about that. I've never have done it all my political life. What we now have is a capitulation. There's no other word to describe it. You can explain it, you can argue for it, but that is what it is. That the third memorandum goes against the 61% who voted to reject the previous memorandum. So it's a betrayal of your own people, and it's a capitulation to the EU leaders who themselves don't care a damn about democracy. So that is the situation we are at now. Who knows what's going to happen? As far as I'm concerned, the members of parliament, Zoe, who should be here, and others who decided that this was too important to put party before the Greek workers and their interests, and who decided to vote against these measures, essentially are the courageous people in Athens today. So, two points now. During the negotiations, from the very beginning, on the 20th of February, the Germans, for their own reasons, not for good reasons, for their own reasons, offered quite a large amount of money to Greece if they could organize an amicable Grexit. Later, weeks later, they made the same offer to Varoufakis. Schäuble actually said, how much do you want to leave? How much? Why? Because the Germans, who were never in favor of the one currency in the first place, but backed down under French pressure, felt that it was now out of control. They need to restructure the Eurozone system. If you look at all the papers being produced by right-wing economists in these countries, they all say that. They can't restructure it with some of these countries in the Eurozone, which is why they were prepared to do a deal. And in my opinion, to be perfectly frank, that deal would have been much better than what finally Greece has accepted. They should have accepted that. Please. And that was the first thing. The second thing, which many of us felt right from the beginning, from February the 20th onwards, was that the big contradiction and weakness which the more cleverest European negotiators saw was the Thessaloniki program, apart from all its good sides and points and demands, which we can all agree with, and which I hope will one day be implemented by someone, also had this dogmatic decision to stay in the Eurozone at all costs. What is the point of fetishizing a currency when a lot more is at stake? No one said it would be easy to Grexit, which is why I said an amicable Grexit would have been the best possible solution. But they didn't do that. Where does this obsession come with? It comes with, I think, the Europhilia that was very widespread in Europe, not just Greece, in the mid to late 80s onwards. Why? Why? Because people saw what Thatcher was doing in Britain. Paul talked about that. And by the way, the British working class still hasn't quite recovered from the miners' strike and the defeat inflicted on it. It hasn't recovered. So the trade unions thought that Jacques Delors offered some hope because he was offering a social Europe. And one of the most amazing sights I've seen, amazing in the sense of slightly odd, was Jacques Delors coming to address the TUC conference in Britain, being given a standing ovation by the brothers and sisters, who spontaneously, not knowing any other French, burst into singing Frère Jacques, which was the only French they'd been taught at primary school. I don't think they teach that today. And just desperation. The only way to defeat Thatcher is link up with something bigger. I understand it in a way. But what they didn't realize, and they couldn't realize at that time, was that the European Union was going to change. After the Maastricht Treaty, there was no excuse not to understand which way Europe was going. We knew what they did when they allowed votes on the new European Constitution, which had at its heart neoliberalism. And the French voted against, despite the fact that the entire media and all the political class were for it. The French voted against, made no difference at all. The Irish voted against it once, were threatened, bullied, cajoled, and they had another referendum to give the Irish people a second chance. And the second time they voted for it. And that should have been the signal as to what Europe had become. That this was the Europe that people were now encountering, a machine for financialized capital and defending the interests of this capital against all comers, whoever wanted to break off. That is what many other parts of Europe and Greece today are suffering from. And I'll tell you something. Normally, what happens in the European Union is of nil interest because they hide most of the bad decisions they make. They're not discussed, they're not talked about. Maastricht was covered up very quickly and all that. What they have done to Greece is unusual because it has been done in public. And the reason it's been done in public is to show the other Europeans, you misbehave and step out of line. See what we did to Syriza? We crucified Tsipras, as two finance ministers said to each other as they were coming out, laughing and joking at their triumph. So in this particular situation, one has to ask, what does it mean to be a member of the European Union? It's not an equal union. It's not a family. Well, it is a family if you look at it like this. That you have a German patriarch schooled in the old disciplinary ways of Prussia. You have his French wife, but she's already having an affair with an American. And you have children, and as we know, in many families of this sort, there's a lot of abuse. And some of the children are being abused. And Varoufakis went and said, you can't humiliate me. You insisted on being treated as an equal, and they couldn't abuse him, so they got rid of him. That's the sort of family that the EU has become today. So even all those of us who are internationalists, Europeans, have to ask, is this the sort of European Union that we want? No. And I say no. We want a different European Union, and we will fight for it in many ways. And the people from below will fight for it too and make changes, because they're the ones who are suffering much more than most of us. Now, the only other referendum coming up is in Britain. Soon. And you know, my own opinion was, for various reasons, that I wouldn't vote. I couldn't vote for the EU, but I said this is the way the right is organizing it, screw them, I'm not going to vote. But not just me, but many other people on the left now are openly discussing creating a special organization, the Left Against Europe, to campaign because of what they've done to Greece, and to campaign to pull out, which would be a blow to them. And of course, all the mainstream parties will be pro-European, and most of the newspapers will be pro-European as such. And in Scotland, there's a huge debate which will take place, because were Scotland to go independent, they would be, if they tried to do anything, they would be treated just like Greece has been treated, and Scottish people are realizing this, and there's much more political consciousness there. In fact, the most radical development on the British Isles has been the emergence of politics and the emergence of a social democratic formation, and to its left, a large far left group. So that's where debates are effectively taking place. So we will see what happens. But in the meantime, we have to stop confusing the Eurozone with the EU, and secondly, confusing the EU with something that is progressive. There is nothing progressive about the EU at all. As to what, we've seen what it's done, and we've seen what impact the capitulation has had, and it's not over. I have to be frank. I don't think this government can last too long after this. I don't know, there's nothing else, don't get me wrong, but I don't think that this government, which has carried out these measures and is in power now with the help of the Conservatives and the remnants of PASOK and the Society for Loving Marie Antoinette, which is what Potami really is. So being in power with the support of these people is an unstable situation. So for whatever reason, they will have to go to the elections within the next 6 months, I would have thought, to clarify the situation and to give Greek voters a chance. And the assumption is that because there's no other party, the masses will turn out and vote for this one. Well, there is another choice, which has been exercised in some countries, which is to stay at home and not vote at all, especially when you're disappointed. So one shouldn't take anything for granted. But the reason all this is happening, is because of this fatal trust in the EU. And that is at the root of this, and that is something that has to be corrected. Okay, thank you.
So, thank you very much, Tariq.
Be right back. I gotta take a shit.